Okay, well, we're taking a look at epistemology, is philosophical theories of knowledge. Now, so what is epistemology other than that? So it comes from the word episteme and logos. So that's knowledge or understanding plus logos, which is the study of. Everyone's pretty familiar with that. One of the questions epistemology would ask is, how should we define knowledge? What do we mean when we say we know something? And what do we mean specifically? How does knowledge differ from belief or opinion? Does knowledge require certainty, or can something be known without certainty, like through intuition or just likelihood? Does that count as knowledge? So we all claim to know certain things like names, dates, places, facts about math, science, history, etc. But how do we know these things? These are all facets of the intellect that many of us take for granted. And once you start to peel the layers back, you see you run into some problems. And that's why epistemology and certain questions, certain epistemological questions, are still firmly in the philosophical discipline. There's a lot that we just don't have answers to yet, and that psychology can't provide answers to it for us about either. So before we keep going, let's take a look at the knowing that versus the knowing how distinction. This is pretty simple. So the standard philosophical analysis of knowledge, it's an analysis of knowing that, right? Knowing how is knowledge as ability and typically can't be verbalized, or at least fully verbalized, like knowing how to ride a bicycle or how to ice skate, for instance. Knowing that, which is our focus here, is called propositional knowledge. Like, for instance, this is a very famous example in philosophy. The cat is on the mat, telling us something about the world. So other propositions would be anything you can say true or false to, even if you don't know the answer. Like, Jessica is sitting in her bedroom. That's a proposition. The sky is blue. That's a proposition. Pudding is delicious. That's a proposition. There is life on other planets. That would be one as well. But knowing how to ride a bicycle or how to ice skate or to snowboard, that's knowing how, and that's not the business that epistemology is very concerned with. Now, the standing definition of knowledge in philosophy is true justified belief. And this goes back to Plato, and it's not without its detractors, but it's a good starting point as we break into epistemology. So any satisfactory definition of knowledge must accommodate the intuition that knowledge involves creditable cognitive success. And TJB, or true justified belief, is the most commonly accepted philosophical definition of knowledge. So a second about this formula. When you see something like this, it means S is subject. So whoever is speaking or thinking, S knows that P standing for the proposition, whatever that might be, the claim, if and only if, that's that IFF. So S knows that P, if and only if, number one, it's true that P is the case. Number two, S is justified in believing that P is the case. And number three, S actually does believe that P is the case. So all three of those conditions are necessary for knowledge. And if you have all three of those, and you can be said to have knowledge. In philo speak, that's known as satisfying both the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge. True, justified belief. If you're missing one, you ain't got knowledge. So let's take a look at these separately. So first, truth as a necessary condition for knowledge. So condition 1 in this analysis tells us that we can't know that which isn't true. Although, of course, there are things that are true that we do not know. For instance, that there is life on other planets. Well, we don't really know that that's true either, but there's a lot that is the case that we just don't know yet, right? But more on truth later, because we're going to treat that as a separate lecture. So for instance, how about this? No knowledge without truth. So we once knew that these things were true, correct? That the world was flat, and if you sailed your ship too far into the horizon, you'd fall off. We knew that was the case. And that the earth was the center of the universe, and everything revolved around us. Correct? We knew that was the case hundreds of years ago. We didn't just use that as a placeholder. We didn't just think, this'll do until we learn the truth. We thought this was the truth at one time. But now looking back, you can say we did not really know that. So these are good examples of the importance of truth in knowledge. Next, justification as a necessary condition for knowledge. So condition 2 tells us that we can't know that we can't know that which we believe without justification or good reasons. And good reasons must be reliable. You have to be able to back up your claims or explain how they got there or how you know something, right? So S is justified in believing that P, if and only if, an ideally rational person, undistracted by passion or interest, would, given the evidence that S has, acquire the belief that P. Very formal, I understand that, but it's kind of important that we go through these at least once. So, for instance, no knowledge without justification. Just imagine this. Imagine someone in a windowless, soundproof room with no contact with anybody and no phone, no means of communication, and they suddenly declare, it's raining outside and I know it, right? This person may believe that, and it may in fact be true, but would you really want to say that he really knew it was raining? If he couldn't hear it, he couldn't see it, he had really no justifiable reason for making that claim? Do you want to call that knowledge? Think about that for a second, and you'll understand the importance of justification in the standard analysis of knowledge in philosophy. And last here is belief. Right? Belief is a necessary condition for knowledge. Condition 3 tells us we can't know that which we don't believe. And we're going to take a soft reading of this here. If truth can be considered an objective requirement for knowledge, belief can be considered a subjective requirement, right? If you don't have conscious awareness of something, it makes little sense to say that it's true, right? Or that you have knowledge of it, for that matter. So think about it this way. To know something about the corpse flower, for instance, you need to first have the object available to your consciousness in the form of a belief about it, and that it may or may not exist, but you still have some kind of belief about it regardless. What features it may or may not have, it's got to be available to your consciousness in some manner. So you cannot know what you have never even entertained in the form of a belief of some sort. Okay. Of course, not everyone agrees, and the TJB theory of knowledge has its detractors. Right? We're just going to look at a couple very briefly here. For one of them, I'm going to direct you to a video. But first, there's the justification problem. Right? So take the proposition, George Washington was the first president of the United States. Well, how do you know that this is true? most people that you ask that of, they're going to say that they know this from some authority. They read it in a book or a teacher told them. How did they know? Well, they knew from another book or from another teacher. So authority as well. Well, how did they know? And this can continue until you trace that fact, quote unquote, back to somebody who experienced George Washington as the President of the United States. Well, you trace it back and back and back until you say, well, my teacher actually knew George Washington, right? Way back then. And then you've got a lineage of the idea, and this is somehow supposed to ground or provide roots for that justification, or the justification of that, the starting proposition, for instance. But how do you know that the person who experienced George Washington first, how do you know that their senses were accurate, right? And this sort of questioning can go on and on ad infinitum, or into infinity, and it becomes what's known as an infinite regress. So the justification problem is levied against the TJB theory of knowledge by saying, look, it makes it fall victim to what's known as an infinite regress. Why? So many of you may be familiar with children get involved in infinite regress, right? So we need a starting assumption or foundational belief if we're going to progress at all in epistemology. We need a starting place where we just say, stop this, let's start here, right? Also, there is the Gettier problem, and the Gettier problem is levied against the TJB theory of knowledge, and there's a short video up there if you're interested in that as well. Take a look at it on the overview page. So, traditional theories of knowledge. There's a few of them. There's many of them today. We're going to look at 3 traditional ones. And what they're taking a stand on is their starting point. Right? Where are we going to stop the whys and the whys and the whys? Where are we going to put an end to the infinite regress and say, look, here's where we begin. Let's build from there. Those 3 theories are rationalism, empiricism, and skepticism. Now, rationalism belongs to the foundationalist camp regarding the nature of rationality. And here are some of their claims. We have innate ideas or notions that are already built into our minds at birth. We're hardwired with certain knowledge, not the kind of knowledge like George Washington was the first president of the United States, but but they're loose ideas, loose kind of categories of understanding. Let's put it that way, right? Like loose ideas about God, or a super being, infinity, and substance were considered innate because no satisfactory empirical origin of them could be conceived. Right? We couldn't perceive these things with our senses. So we just said, look, we must be born with these notions, however loosely established. And we know that these innate ideas are true because we have direct intellectual intuition of them. We have reason. And our knowledge, then, is a priori, which means it's Latin for prior to experience. An a priori claim is a claim whose truth or falsity can be known independently of observation. And so, for instance, if I say a triangle has 3 sides, that would be considered an a priori claim, because I don't have to go out and count every triangle in the world to say whether that's true or false. It's true by definition. That's considered a priori. So the rationalist camp says this is our starting point. We have these innate categories of the understanding already built into our heads. And then we apply these categories to the world outside, and they enable us to make sense of all the sense data that's being thrown at us on a daily basis, right? We shove them into these categories that we are born with. Like we look at any sort of thing, a television, it goes into substance, it's matter. Or we look at some change, right? That thing just changed into, that was one thing, now it's another. And we put that into this cause and effect innate notion that we already came stocked with, as it were. Descartes' an example of a rationalist. Let's look at empiricists. Also belongs to the foundationalist camp regarding the nature of rationality. They say, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is not true, rationalists. The mind is actually, you don't have any innate ideas or categories of the understanding. The mind's a blank slate when we're born. It's clear. It's a tabula rasa. More Latin, but their words. Sensations make imprints upon that slate. We're born with it perfectly clear, and as we begin to gather sense data about the world, it makes its marks on our minds. Right? And from these impressions, we learn what is true and false, and we build up a bank of knowledge over the years. Right? And eventually, our sensations kick in our reasoning processes, right? So do you see what I mean here? So for the rationalists, the reasoning processes come first, and then sensation and sense data is put into these categories that we come pre-supplied with. For the empiricists, those categories don't exist until we get enough sense data stored up that our mind just goes to work on them in these ways. Okay. So our knowledge is a posteriori, not a priori, like the rationalists said, but a posteriori, meaning after experience or as a result of experience or dependent upon experience. We cannot know anything prior to experience, only after it. An a posteriori claim is one whose truth or falsity can be known only by appealing to experience once again. So for instance, if I were to say, my dog is sitting outside of my bedroom door, I can't just reflect on what it means to be a dog and what it means to be outside of my bedroom door to try to say that is true or false. I have to open the door. I have to experience. My knowledge of whether or not that proposition that my dog is outside of the door is true is a result of me confirming it with the senses. And then finally, there's skepticism, which doesn't really belong to either camp, strictly speaking. And skepticism says there's no way to solve. You're not going to find a starting point. Right? It's not rationalist, because that begs the question. It's not empiricist, because that begs the question. You're kind of stuck in a rut, so to speak. Common sense or ordinary skepticism is suspending judgment about things, like ordinary incredulity, and kind of a healthy attitude, so that we don't become gullible to others who claim to have knowledge, and there are a lot of them out there. Excuse me. Excuse me. That can come to an end once we've verified or falsified whatever proposition we're dealing with. Then there's methodological skepticism, and that subjects all knowledge claims to scrutiny with the goal of sorting out true from false claims. It's a method. You, instead of just being an ordinary skeptic, which is just a healthy attitude, you apply skepticism as a method, as like a, I was going to say colander, but sifting device, to make sure that the claims that you commit yourself to pass the test, if you will. And then there's absolute skepticism, and that doubts the very possibility of knowledge. It's self-refuting, leads to infinite regress. You can check that out on your own if you are interested. Don't be interested. It's not cool.